language is weak, as I like to point out sometimes, but it's the best tool that we have often, typically. In language case, is weak. Oops, sorry. As I like to echoing, I point out. So what I was going to say is it's a tremendous honor to have Shunyamurti join us today, beyond the capacity of my language. And I was hoping, Shunyamurti, you could say a little bit about your name before I introduce you a little more formally, please.
Well, namaste. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Shivoham. Om Tat Sat. Those are the three mantras of Sat Yoga. So I would like to start with that. The name that was given was to indicate the emptiness. Shunya means emptiness, and it is that void out of which all emerges and which it contains all, but in itself has no identity, and to whom there is no I and no other. And murti is the form in which that consciousness is able to function within the phenomenal plane.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And if I'll take a couple of minutes just to introduce you a little more formally, which is to say that Shunyamurti, I consider, for what it's worth, I consider Shunyamurti to be one of the great teachers of our times, not least because he is extremely capacious in his knowledge and his breadth of knowledge and depth, and the tremendous heart that he brings to his teachings, with a genuine compassion that I feel and sense, and no doubt his students who are closer to him sense. All too often, sadly, we one of the painful realities of the spiritual life is that we have hierarchies that are set up, and very often, consciously or unconsciously, some abuses will happen. And I mean, it's such a breath of fresh air to meet teachers such as Shunyamurti, and to be able to speak to teachers like him, and to be reminded that we don't, things need not be as Foucauldian, and not that Foucault sort of decided for us the power knowledge thing, but he kind of identified some this phenomenon for us. So that being said, just by way of introduction, to share the screen here, Shunyamurti is the founder and really the primary teacher, the lead teacher of the Sat Yoga Ashram Institute and Foundation. It's a wisdom school and residential sanctuary. It's, and just to read from the text here, the Sat Yoga Institute offers a path to realization of the Supreme Self, the all-pervading consciousness that lies beyond the event horizon of time and death. Our wisdom school continues the tradition of passing on the universal transformational training that has been the foundation of every enduring culture from time immemorial. Shunyamurti, could you say a little bit about this this idea of the Sophia Perennis that many scholars, teachers, mystics have written and spoken of and lived in many ways very profoundly?
I think that all the great sages of every tradition who have been founders of schools, of new dispensations, all come from a place of consciousness that's beyond language, and are not identified with signifiers, but with the ultimate signified that cannot be ever fully expressed or translated, whether into language or art or music or any other form. So there's always a gap between what can be said and what must be pointed to, but not mistaken for that which is being pointed to. So as the Zen masters always say, don't mistake the finger pointing to the moon for the moon. So we have always, I think, that understanding that there is one truth, and that one truth can be spoken in many ways, and that each apparently different paradigm of reality that takes on a specific brand name, let's say, whether Buddhism or Advaita or Islam or Sufism, whatever it might be, is simply an expression of a facet of that infinite diamond of the infinite mind of God that cannot be fully expressed in any one of those traditions, which is the reason why that source has given us so many flowers in the garden to be able to appreciate the different aspects of beauty and of truth, and not to force us to choose one, but to appreciate the loveliness of the entire creation and its unity with the Creator. So that Sophia Perennis, I think, is the essence of every religion. And I think that those sages who have reached the peak of the mountain of God, as it were, would all agree on that truth as being one, and how it is expressed is unimportant. And it is more for the cultural context in which it is given than it has to do with the source from which it comes.
Thank you so much for that. What do we say, if indeed it is our or my job to speak to people who argue for their brand being the only brand that is valid? So you have Mac users, they're obsessed with Macs, right? But I mean, that's a poor example. But I mean, not to go on and on about, because I think too much, all too often, too much is made of the interreligious strifes that have happened historically. I think it has happened, they have happened. But if we read history, of course, we know there was incredible interreligious cross-pollination and sort of learning from one another as well. And it's a, strangely enough, strange as far as the kind of mainstream narrative is concerned, right? The sort of non-academic narrative that, oh, religions were the source of all the troubles in human history and we need to just get rid of it, because I mean, that's just false. It turns out that it's an especially, one may say, modern phenomenon when people's religious identities become so hardened. And some of the greatest mystics and therefore some of the greatest thinkers the world has ever seen came from all the great traditions and all the major traditions and minor traditions, as pragmatic terms. In any case, what do we say to people who want to go on and on about their way being the only way?
Well, first of all, let me just add that not only are there inter-religious conflicts, but intra-religious ones even more. So, for example, Rumi was a great model of someone who was very much tied to Islam until he met Shams. And then he realized, no, Islam is not my religion, love is my religion. And he was as much a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Hindu as he was a nominal Muslim. But he had to be very careful in a certain way to hide a lot of his universality in a religious context and encoded often in the Matnawi in ways that would not be obvious to those who would have persecuted him, as happened to Suravardi in that tradition, who was executed for being too open about that. So this is always an issue of closed minds. But I would also like to emphasize that it is a modern and postmodern phenomenon. And what we're talking about is not really religion, but a belief system. And today, I would say scientism is the false religion that is the belief system that has captured people's minds in a much more hardened and closed way to their utter destruction. And their belief in it has caused them to self-sabotage their lives because they mistake the signifier of science for true knowledge, and believe whatever a so-called expert in that field would tell them, and they are often led down a path of making some very grave mistakes. So the real issue is to have a capacity to think critically and very consciously from within the phenomenal plane, let's say, level of reality, but also to recognize that that is not the only reality. That is the most gross level of reality. And only when we have transcended what let's call the ego plane, the ego being the operating system of the body that has certain skills and functions in order to enable the organism to navigate its way through the phenomenal plane, but that we also have a soul consciousness, which is the witness to that and is not tied to that level of very temporal reality, a very small sliver of time in which we occupy a particular body and live a life that is limited to the mortality of the body from the ego level. But the soul continues, existed before the body, will continue. And beyond the soul, we have what we can call the Atman, or the Holy Spirit, the Absolute, that is transcendent entirely of this plane. And it's an entire spectrum of consciousness, but most people today occupy only the lowest level of the spectrum. And this, I think, is the cause of the great suffering in the world and the great need for people to hold on to belief systems because they lack a sense of essence within. They lack a sense of real being. And because they don't know who they are, they want to hold on to an illusion of certainty. But this is a defense against the emptiness that one will feel when one lets go of the ego identity, and a fear of that depersonalization that comes when one does let go. And if one doesn't have faith and a sense of the consciousness that extends beyond the event horizon of the ego, one can indeed fall into a psychotic state rather than a mystical transcendence of the ego. So there are a lot of difficulties in this path. And it's very easy for the narcissistic ego to try to appropriate those higher levels of consciousness, which leads to many of the problems with religion that those people point to, of false gurus, etc. But nonetheless, just because there are counterfeit bills doesn't mean that there isn't a real one. In fact, there must be a real one. There must be true gold, true value, and a true source of the existence of all of this. And only when we have accepted the need to discover that for oneself and become a scientist of one's own consciousness can we discover that truth, not dependent on reading books or believing in scriptures. So I think even if one has a faith in religion, one has to corroborate that through one's own experience, one's own realization of that truth. Otherwise, one is simply a parrot rather than a true being who can speak as a witness to that truth that is transcendent.
And this this idea of experiential knowledge, tasting, really not just parroting, as you say, knowledge. The Quranic metaphor that comes to mind is that of the donkey with the books on its back. I mean, it hasn't really, I mean, it's carrying these books, but what does it know really of the knowledge? It's something, I remember hearing you mention that, if I'm remembering this correctly, the difference between knowledge and wisdom is that as wisdom is fermented knowledge or information. So and that fermentation is a process. It doesn't just happen overnight. Sometimes the fermentation can go badly and it can go moldy, and that can do all sorts of. And speaking of, poisonous fermented, apparently fermented knowledge. I mean, you mentioning earlier about regarding the narcissistic types or egos that seek to appropriate a notion of the absolute and claim it for themselves within a sort of religious, historically religious framework, shall we say. There are many people today who will try to approach and appropriate the absolute through psychedelic experiences. I have absolutely nothing against those experiences, but it's not, as far as I can tell, it's not that easy to really. One may have intimations of the transcendent through such experiences, but then to say, well, because of some acid trip or over a weekend or what have you, I now know the truth. I mean, I think it's a little harder than that. Again, with zero judgment. I've sort of done my own. I've had my own experiments in that regard.
Yes, I think that's the modern day quick fix and shortcut to wanting to experience the transcendent truth. But it gives one not only just a glimpse, but only a glimpse of that which is still within the mind. And it is a confusion usually that arises between the subconscious hallucinatory information that comes from one's own individual field of consciousness, along with some information from the superconscious. But it usually gets mixed and distorted by the ego that is experiencing it. And I've had many people come to our ashram saying, I did ayahuasca and I went through ego death. But clearly their ego was still there, and they had an illusion or a momentary stopping of the mind in which there was presence. But that's very different from having transcended the mind and realized the self that is always transcendent and not dependent on substances or situations. And so it is that true realization that takes a tremendous amount of discipline and work and sacrifice in order to achieve. That is the real goal and the real gold that enables one then to be able to guide and to teach and to, let's say, ground a community, or ultimately a new order that we must bring into being in this world that is collapsing because of the lack of true beings who can stand for the truth and can arbitrate from a non-egocentric position all of the apparent conflicts and bring harmony and cooperation and unity to this entire noetic field.
So beautifully put, as always. And what I'm hearing also in your description of the as it were, the conditions that can create such a community or communities, there's a deep humility that's required as well, which all too often is lacking in many sort of groupings and or people who, they'll make big claims, and but maybe one of those fundamental, perhaps that fundamental ingredient is missing. So how can we make such claims?
Yes, I think that we have to approach this as researchers and to continue to learn and to grow. There is never an end to infinite intelligence. And the more that we download, the more humble we become, but also the more powerful. And, speaking of your mention of the metaphor of the donkey, I'd like to bring Nietzsche's metaphor at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where first you go out as a camel carrying all of the baggage of the culture and the religion and the science, but then the camel transforms into a lion. So the humility becomes power. But that power then becomes innocence and remorphs again into a child. And so we have to go through all three of those levels. We have to have the power to face the people of the lie and the illusions, and to be able to stand our ground and speak truth when we are perhaps being smeared or attacked from those closed minds, and not to back down or to be at all injured by it, because we know the truth and we know the being that transcends the apparent individual. And it is only because one has gone through all of those that real innocence can emerge again, that is beyond even the humility or the opposite of that. There is just simply an accuracy that comes in any given situation that has no relationship to an ego, but simply to truth and beauty itself.
And the metaphor that is often used, of course, is that of becoming an instrument in this sort of hands of the divine, or what have you. Could you speak a little bit, because this is something I have had occasion to think a lot about in my own, trying to figure out my own life and just trying to make sense of the world. The question around sanity versus insanity. I mean, we're living, as far as I can tell, we're living through increasingly insane times, and it's very scary where things are going. People, I've heard it put like this, that by people I consider to know what they're talking about. I've heard it put like this on occasion, that one can see people walking through the streets, and they may not even be aware that not only are they suffering, but maybe they're almost possessed. There's some. It's a very strange time of all sorts of influences. I mean, it's not sort of shall we say, it's not so cool to talk about the demonic realm anymore, because one can't speak of the divine realm anymore. And what's that famous quote, the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was to convince people that he didn't exist. But we're living in times where people, as far as I can tell, for what it's worth, people who control things I'm not under any illusions as to the power of certain unseen forces and realms, and very often a lot of these technologies utilize, not to get sort of conspiratorial about things, but I mean, we have influences, inspirations from the angelic realms, from the divine realms, as well as influences and inspirations from darker realms, and it's. And this is what the traditional, all the traditions have taught us. Traditional metaphysics lays out for us very clearly.
Yes. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think we have to contextualize this in terms of history, that all of the ancient world traditions accepted that time is cyclical, and we start out at a golden age, and we gradually fall to a silver age, and then a copper, and then an iron age. Kali Yuga is the name for that iron age in the Indian tradition. And it is that time period when the human nature, which is a variable, not a constant, has grown a certain kind of an ego that never existed in earlier times. The postmodern ego is extremely fragmented, dissociated, repressed and censored, and completely out of touch with reality. And this ego structure has been in part engineered by forces that wanted to disempower the individual, so that those centralized ruling elites would not have any rivals. So we also see social movements in which the clans were destroyed, and the families and the farmers, and we had urbanization, and then an educational system that dumbed people down, and deliberate loss of critical thinking and psychological maturity. et cetera, et cetera. So there has been an extraordinary move of disinformation and disempowerment that has brought about what is now openly called mass psychosis. And it is a fact. And I would say that the norm of the ego today is a psychotic state of consciousness. And in psychoanalysis, they speak of a particular form of psychosis that they call normosis, or someone who is normotic, which means a psychotic desperation to look normal. But they are completely out of their right mind and trying to fit in and follow the herd and do what they're supposed to and virtue signal and all of those things that we all know about. And within underneath that, a total confusion, anxiety, dread, and inability to function. And more people are losing it, committing suicide, murder and suicide, and they're going berserk in every possible way. So we literally see the destruction of the human spirit happening in the world today, nothing less than that. So not only social decomposition and collapse of the social order, which is also deliberately engineered, which is now bringing food shortages and, as you see, wars and building up to a global war, but the actual psychological state of the individual is already destroyed. There's no access to the heart, no access to love, no, not even a belief in love, let alone a belief in God. And so most people are really in a very wrecked condition psychologically and spiritually. And many people who are trying to heal from that come to the ashram to try to receive healing through meditation and individual work and all of that. But the ego still holds on tenaciously to its delusions out of that fear of letting go and being totally lost. And so it's a very pitiable condition that the human being has reached in these last days, which is why, in a way, there's a merciful end that God has planned so that people's suffering can end as quickly as possible, and a new world can take its place. So the kingdom of heaven is real, and although people have lost belief in that, nonetheless, at the same time, very interestingly, science itself is beginning to show that the world is what they call a simulation, is actually very much like something computer generated, and quantum physics is supporting that. But this is really a replication of the ancient idea of Maya, of the world as a dream, as an illusion. And in fact, that is the case. It's created by consciousness. And as our consciousness loses its integrity and coherence and becomes the kind of egos that we have today, we project a world that is filled with conflicts. So there's a feedback loop. We can't say that the world has caused the ego to degenerate, because it's also true that the ego has caused the world to degenerate. And this feedback loop between subjectivity and objectivity is always at work.
To pick up on one of your series of incredible points about people no longer believing in love. I mean, I was first, I mean, this is particularly noticeable amongst younger people. I remember talking to some younger people. I'm not going to reveal how old I am, but I'm no longer in my 20s, let's put it like that. People in their 20s saying that they never had experienced love, and they almost didn't believe in it. And it was very hard for me to understand that, as someone who's kind of, been, shall we say, something of a hapless romantic or hopeless romantic, but it's like people no longer even believe in love. They no longer experience love. That's really telling. And to pick up on that point, you mentioned that putting aside belief in God, I mean, which is, one can say that's the ultimate form of love. I mean, to really know God, is to truly love the divine. But all the songs historically, I mean, even until not too long ago, they were about love and pretty cute and, you know, romantic. Now songs increasingly, I mean, maybe I'm just revealing how old I am at this point, but the songs are very kind of rough and crude, and it's the notion of romance has gone. The notion of, I don't know, you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Sure, of course. You see, the problem, first of all, is vertical. As you say, we're cut off from God, who is the source of love, and even from the soul. And so you only have a body-identified mind. Now, what the postmodern age has done is taken away gender identity from people. So love used to be able to exist when a man was a man and a woman was a woman, and you could have yang and yin come together in a complementary relationship. But as Lacan pointed out already back in the 50s, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. There is no longer any relationship between the male and the female, because those structures have been corrupted in such a way that men are always doubting their manhood or their heterosexuality, and the same with the woman. And you have the phallus as this form of power that is dominance, that has nothing to do with the original meaning, which goes back to the Shiva Lingam. But there is now only a power struggle and even a confusion about what power is and what anyone really wants. And the projections that one puts on another in order to create the illusion of a relationship cannot last very long. And soon the apparent desire turns into repulsion or a Cold War. And we see that all the time. And society, again, is partly responsible for bringing that about. And that loss of manhood shows up in every way in society, not just in love relationships, but in the inability of corporations, even armies, the world to function. We're not producing statesmen or stateswomen. We're not producing beauty anymore. The arts are dead. Drama is dead. Music, all of what made human life valuable and meaningful is gone today. We don't see any greatness left. The human spirit has been put out. And that is the real tragedy of the current situation.
It's deeply, deeply tragic. And only God knows how history will remember these years and decades that we're passing through. And it seems to me that the sort of wheel is speeding up increasingly and increasingly. To your point about the Lacanian point about the ambiguity of the sexual, the gender differences and identities, this seems to be one of the, not seems to be, at least in the West, it's a big point of contention, and one can't even talk about these things in civilized liberal discourse, right? To make some of the, I mean, I tend to agree with you that historically, which is not to say that there aren't exceptions to the rule. I think traditional, and history bears this out, traditional cultures recognized third genders, but the majority of people, these are the exceptions to the rule. If we take the exceptions and try to then foist these upon the rest of society, then that's not going to be good for us. And there's something of an inversion happening. It's as a man, I know, because I experienced this historically, I had to really work hard, consciously and unconsciously, to figure out, what does it mean to be a man? Like, how am I supposed to, how do I relate to the opposite sex, A, but B, also, how do I project myself out into the world? Is it okay to be firm at times? Something that I like to say that very often women will sort of raise an eyebrow when I say this, and I'll sort of say, I'll add that I've actually thought a lot about this, and I'm always open to correction, but I for example, do not like the word nice in describing it. Men are not meant to be nice. We're meant to be compassionate. We're meant to be kind and caring. But what nice man has ever done? I mean, I'm sure I'm wrong, but Christ was not nice. You know, if he were nice, he would not have been crucified. He would not have overturned the moneylender's table, for example. The Buddha was not nice. Gandhi was not nice, right? Malcolm X wasn't nice. They were extremely kind, and I'm sure they had their own, I mean, flaws. You know, Gandhi had his own flaws and so forth. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about not to say the problem of masculinity, but what advice would you give to younger men and not so young men who are struggling to be men in this day and age?
Yes, it's a very good question. And what you said was very well said about that we have to go beyond niceness or any other stereotype of either the masculine or the feminine. And I think the blessing that is contained in the gender confusion today and the confusion of the social order entirely about our human identity, what is beautiful about it is that it enables us then to recognize that each consciousness has both a masculine and a feminine polarity. It's not a question of choosing. Why not accept the entirety of our consciousness, and rather than try to be a man or try to be a woman, be a soul, be a manifestation of God consciousness? That to me is the only way out of the particular trap that we have in our social order today. We have to transcend all the attempts to define ourselves in a certain way or to relate according to any norm. It's over already. There's too much chaos. And all that now can work is to be in truth with oneself. And then one will be powerful, one will be courageous, but one will also be compassionate and loving and have the best of both the masculine and feminine forms of grace. In a unified form. And that to me is the meaning of the spiritual unification of Shiva and Shakti. That is that final stage of the realization of the absolute. So that to me is where we must bring our attention now, not to try to simply make a persona that will somehow be able to function in a crazy world.
Yes, that very important, very, very important to note that, not to get stuck in this sort of identity of I'm a man or I'm a woman or what have you. Yes, absolutely. And traditional metaphysics is very clear about on this point that we all have masculine and feminine dimensions within us, and it's a question of integrating the two. It's a question of ultimately going beyond the sort of almost the accidental conditions around those things. Could you say a little more, you've already touched upon this in very beautiful ways and powerful ways, about the external craziness and strife and turmoil that we see around us, and increasingly so, sadly. At the same time, there's a lot of beauty. Let's not, I mean, I think I should remind myself as well that the news functions by sort of sometimes overhyping, overemphasizing all the awfulness in the world, which is not to say that awfulness doesn't exist. I came across a quote today from Jacques Ellul, the great French philosopher and social critic, and something along the lines of how the camera, by virtue of being present, creates the event, something along those lines. So, which is an interesting insight. But to the original point that I was trying to raise and question is, how is the external world a reflection of the inner world? And traditional metaphysics says this is the case. So how can we realize that reality instead of seeing the other as the other, the person who is confronting me and making my life hell and really stressing me out, how can I realize, not just theoretically, that person is actually a reflection of my own inner states, and or perhaps this person is present in my life because there is some lead, there is some lead within me which still needs to be alchemized, and so on.
Yes, I think that's a very important and very traditional point, that the world is a projection. And it is a projection on many different levels. For the ego, the projection is always going to be of disowned aspects of your own shadow. And therefore, you're going to always have a hard time with people, because whatever internal conflicts are unbearable will be turned into external conflicts. So one can blame the other and then get away from them and think one is being free from a problem, when the problem will follow one into the next relationship and the next. So indeed, we must use our world as messages about what is happening within the soul and within the subconscious. Once that has been purified and cleared out, then we will see the world as a projection from a higher level of consciousness. Then we will see all the beauty, and even the ugliness will show up as incredible beauty. And I think that was the great message of Zainab, after that destruction that the Shiites went through, that she saw the divine beauty even in the massacre. And we have to see that now, that the coming end of this world of suffering is a blessing. And we are returning to the light, to the love that we have lost in this world. We are being drawn back into the source of our being to recover all that we have lost. And the world being only a kind of a movie on the screen of consciousness, when that movie ends, we return to the source of the intelligence that created it, and we are then able from that highest place to project a new film that can be a kingdom of heaven. And that's what we should focus on doing now. The only way to turn this hell realm into heaven is to find that heaven within, and then it will be projected without as well.
I remember, what was I going to say? I've lost my train of thought now. But I've completely lost my train of thought. That's fine. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. Could you speak a little more about the Kali Yuga? What are its signs? What are its symptoms? And what do we do? What I wanted to mention, it just came back to me, that I remember hearing many years ago it being put like this, that the saint or the sage doesn't seek to, which is very paradoxical, of course, who does not seek to, he or she, to change anything, because everything is just as it's meant to be. And and the paradox, of course, is, well, does that mean if we see ills in the world and wrongdoings, we just sit back and say, well, that's just God's will, or this is just meant to be?
No, not at all. One participates in the world and does one's best to bring beauty and truth and love into the world. But one accepts it as it is, and one recognizes the limitations of the ability to reform a certain situation that must go through to its end in order for the ultimate truth to be revealed from the working out of the logic that is unmanifest. David Bohm, the physicist, said we have an implicate order and an explicate order, but that implicate order must express itself. And so we must work through the darkest of the dark in order to return to the light. And all of both sides of this, the entire spectrum of consciousness, is beautiful and perfect. And we have to accept that it's a pendulum. And when we're in the darkest hour of the world, then we know the dawn is very close. And that's the blessing of this moment.
And regarding the Kali Yuga, and all the traditions, of course, speak of and warn of conditions, human conditions, which are so difficult, so dark, and different sort of traditions offer, as it were, difference. Ultimately, the solutions are in essence the same. It's about God consciousness. It's about doing the right thing. I mean, there's a famous prophetic tradition in the Islamic tradition where the Prophet of Islam said that if the day of judgment comes upon you and in your hand is a sapling, go ahead and plant the sapling, which is a very interesting. Like, what would be the point of planting a little sapling when the day of judgment is already here? But it's this sense that we should always be doing good things no matter what. But what would you, Shunyamurti, what would you suggest as some things to bear in mind and do in these increasingly difficult times?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that point that you bring up about planting the sapling is, in other words, keep your sanskaras, your tendencies pure. Be someone who does good and speaks in goodness and in truth and in harmony. And so in whatever time you are or whatever situation, allow the purity of your heart to express itself. Don't wither, don't become defensive, don't get angry, don't get in a negative state. And always remain open to the infinite and allow yourself to be an instrument of that. So the real truth is we are not the doers. This film that we are in is already shot. We are watching it. We are not actually in it, okay? Which is why the traditions say, yes, we're in the world, but not of it. So in that sense, we are witnesses who are already transcendent. We're already liberated from the illusion, but we don't know it because we're focused in the illusion. So what we must do is take our consciousness back to the source of our being, rather than externalizing and being concerned with the world. Since it is a projection, return to the source. And when you are in that state, you will see the world doesn't really even exist. It was never created because it's a dream. You know, in the Vaishnav traditions, Mahavishnu is asleep in the ocean of milk, right? This is all a dream. And so when he wakes up, the world is withdrawn back into that state of absolute bliss. So we can be in that bliss while alive. And this is what is called Jivan Mukti, to be liberated while alive, to be totally free, because we know we're not the body. And when you are in that state and you don't fear death, then you can be in a state of joy. And one can see that even if there seems to be massive death, but in fact, there is one intelligence dreaming all of this. There isn't really a multiplicity. And it's only when we recognize that unity that appears as multiplicity, but is not, that we have the power to act in such a way that brings the vibrational frequency of that unity that is God consciousness into the morphogenetic field that can inspire and awaken and illuminate other consciousnesses to the one self.
And I want to be respectful of your time, of course, so we'll wrap up soon. I mean, I'm happy to continue, depending on, I'm sure, but I wanted to raise a quote from yourself that I came across recently. I think it's from one of your recent teachings. If I'm remembering correctly, I'm not going to do it justice, something along the lines of most people want to free their egos from pain, but they don't want to free their consciousness from the ego. Could you say a little bit? And this, to me, this strikes me as the crux of the problem. That yes, and pain, we should not. I mean, we should do our best to free ourselves of pain, and do our best to free others from pain, and so forth. And at the same time, the continual movement should be towards greater and greater consciousnesses, or sort of an ever expanding consciousness, as it were, which is ultimately inseparable from the absolute consciousness.
Well, this goes back to Buddha's four Aryan truths. The ego is pain and suffering. It is dukkha. That's the nature of the structure of split mind, in which we are alienated from ourself, that we consider to be a world in which we are different and separate and alone and lonely. And so it is all those emotions that are created by the ignorance, the avidya, the illusion that the ego is in, that is the problem. It isn't caused by external conditions. Those conditions result from the split mind. So when we unify our consciousness again and go beyond both subject and object, then we are beyond suffering. And we realize that we are unborn and we are in a changeless state. That's what Brahman is. That's what Shiva consciousness is. So once we understand that that's what we are, then we can withdraw our consciousness from the belief that we are simply a mortal body that suffers pains, etc., and not be disturbed by the condition of the body and whatever symptoms it might have. And most people are suffering physically and mentally today. And the medical system is, if anything, making it worse for most people. So we have to return to the source of our being to find healing. The word heal itself comes from wholeness. To be healed means to be whole. So we have to find that whole consciousness that is our original true nature and return to it and be in it, and not think that it's impossible and that this is only for Zen masters or for Christian mystics. No, this is the condition of everyone. We are all manifestations of God consciousness, and anyone at any moment can let go of the ego if we have the courage to do it, and surrender to the unknown God. But that force, that grace will come to us. We can be released from our suffering if we will surrender to that God, even if we don't have belief or knowledge based on some experience or imperience in the past. If we are suffering enough and we're willing to let go and not commit suicide of the body, but instead go through ego death, we will find eternal life. And that is, to me, what everyone is being forced to do in these final days. There is no hope any longer on the physical plane, but there is a great hope and a great salvation available if we will turn to it.
Regarding the vital importance of healing ourselves so that we can become whole, so that we can experience something of the holy ultimately, something that comes to mind, one of many things, is how at the same time the cards are stacked against us a little bit. And just to give one example, that of seems like a very simple, simplistic, conspiratorial notion, but fluoride, which turns out to be scientifically proven for the longest time, conspiracy theorists were written off as being conspiracy theorists for saying that fluoride calcifies the pineal gland. It turns out it has been shown scientifically to be the case. So, there are certain, I think, things that we have to do on the physical realm as well. You're not denying that we should do those things as well to help. To help this process of continual spiritual growth and consciousness, and part of the process is education and learning how maybe traditional people lived, being grounded, walking barefoot on the ground, not being so disconnected from our mother, which is nature, but recognize that we're rooted in it and come from it.
Nature is our mother, but spirit is our father. So I partly agree with you, but I would say that our consciousness, because it projects the body, it is not actually in the body. It projects itself to be in it. but we're not dependent on the pineal gland either. Even if your pineal gland is totally calcified, you can be in samadhi and in God consciousness. Don't think you're dependent on the organism's condition to be liberated, because all it is a matter of is stopping thought and being in silence by turning to the source of your being. And nothing can stop that, because it has nothing to do with physical processes, nothing to do with brains, nothing to do with neurochemistry. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's prior to our incarnation. We exist as souls transcendent of this plane, and we can return to that consciousness through an effort to realize the self, regardless of the state of the body.
And in conclusion, if you would kindly, Shunyamurti, maybe mention for our audience a little bit about your most recent book, The Tao of the Final Days, an adaptation of the Tao Te Ching. What I don't know if you have a copy of that book to hand, if you would like to, I mean, just read something from there or mention something from there that we, no doubt so much of what we've been talking about is a distillation and is taken from there already, but because this is your...
Well, I don't have the book handy at the moment, but let me say this, that the Taoist sages 5,000 years ago already foresaw all of this. Both Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Li-Tzu, there were a number of them. There were several wisdom schools that later became called Taoism. In fact, that was a later use of the word, but that term Tao was present for Chinese philosophers, even Confucianists and others. And the Taoists understood that the world is indeed a hologram. They understood the perspectival nature of everyone's reality. They understood that you could be yin in relation to one person and yang in another, and in different situations and moments you would switch. They understood all of the indeterminacy of consciousness. They saw the world degenerating. They saw it already in those days that technology was taking over, even in the form of fishing nets and other things that were destroying the environment and the fishing areas that were not people were overfishing. Greed was taking over, and it was the period of the warring states. So there were already wars and warlords, and at least in those days, they knew that they had to sustain their kingdom. So Lao Tzu was in a way a kind of consultant, and his wisdom school was a think tank, and they would get hired by kings and prime ministers to give wisdom as to how do we sustain this community, this city-state, whatever. And so the wisdom was still appreciated, and it could filter down from the top. Today, of course, that's impossible. So now we need a grassroots approach to the Tao. So I have been meditating on Lao Tzu's incredible work, and not trying to translate it, because there are already many translations, but to adapt to it in a way that would ask the question, if Lao Tzu were here now, what would be the Tao Te Ching that he would deliver? And to try to download through focusing on the Tao and on that great sagely vibrational frequency that understands and is surrendered to the absolute, to bring in messages and information that could help people navigate through these final days. And to put it into very simple terms so that anyone could understand it, to help people to deal with the food shortages that are coming, and obviously all of the other catastrophes that we are going through as a result of social processes, but also of geological changes. The earth itself is going through a cleansing that is increasing. And so is the sun. If you see the coronal mass ejections that are hitting the earth more, affecting our whole noosphere, atmosphere, all of that, we're the magnetosphere. The earth poles are shifting. We're going through a massive change, and the message is there for everyone. This isn't just about the human level of nature. This is cosmic. And so we are in the hands of God. And the more that we surrender to that power, the more that we will be led into living in a way which will bring the optimal outcome and will bring our consciousness to have the grace of that presence of the supreme consciousness to bring us out of suffering and into the light. So the book is meant to be a guidebook for those who seek support on their spiritual journey.
So very beautiful. Perhaps I did say that in conclusion, but perhaps in real conclusion, you could leave us with a brief prayer. I'd be very grateful for that.
Mm. May we have the wisdom, the courage, the strength, the purity of heart, the love to turn inward to the source of our being, to turn inward to accept the grace of God, whose presence is always here with us, and to be filled with that light, with that power, with that love of God, by emptying out of the ego, emptying out of the lower mind, and keeping ourselves as receptacles that are pure and clear, to be able to be transceivers of this ultimate reality of the presence of God pervading the entire cosmos and creating, sustaining, and now destroying and withdrawing its energies from the manifest and returning us all into the unmanifest, into the source of our being. May we go into that great light with love, with joy, without resistance, without fear, without alienation, to know that we are children of God, we are manifestations of God, and we belong to that light, to that love, to the source that is forever luminous and filled with grace, to be transcendent again of this worldly illusion and to become avatars of that power supreme to enable all beings to be uplifted into the energy field of supreme love. And may we all be liberated now to live in freedom as manifestations of the Absolute. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Well, what can I say other than say thank you, really, from the depths of my soul and heart, and may God continue to bless you and empower you in all the incredible work that you're doing and the community that you have around you. May God expand your community. May more and more people. I've been saying to people that I predict in the next 2 to 3 years that Shunyamurti is going to, so many more people are going to know him, as it should be, because we all need great teachers like yourself. And it's such a tremendous blessing, really, to be able to spend some time with you today. And I hope I may be able to see you in person one day. I really hope for that. That'd be amazing. So
I hope so too, Hassan. You're always welcome here in our ashram, and I thank you for the service you are doing. You are indeed a great instrument to bring peace and knowledge and love and joy back into the world. And I appreciate the greatness of your spirit in being able to function in such a humble but such a powerful way, to be a liaison to bring the light into the darkness. So thank you, my friend.
Deeply humbled and very grateful for those kind words. And please keep us in your prayers that this humble and sometimes not so humble, admittedly, person can continue to do what he's meant to do. Well, I thank you again, and namaste. Bye. And thank you all for joining us, and please continue to support us, and please continue to support our wonderful teacher in everything that he does, because we really need, again, teachers like him.